Okay. I know in my session, I also went through few things a little too rapidly, too fast. And so a few people I talked to later on, I realized that some of the basic things may not have been very clear. So I just want to ask you two questions to make sure that we are aligned at least on what we did in the previous session, right? So remember one example was about the ITQ for fishing, like creating community rights in fish, right? And I gave an example earlier that suppose a fisherman in Kerala, if he catches a small fish under the current system in Kerala, he would not throw the small fish back in the water, right? Do you remember why? Why wouldn't he throw the small fish back in the water? Someone else may collect it and keep the fish, right? So then why not me, right? So tragedy of the collective or commons or the free riding problem, right? Now if you put the same fisherman in Iceland in the ITQ system, if you remember the ITQ system, right? Uh, would he throw the small fish back in the water? Yes. Why?
After all, it is only a limited amount of fish he can fish in a day, and he needs to do the business for like life and maybe generations. So he will want more fish, and he owns the sort of owns those that amount of fish. So okay.
Getting on the path, but
You would trust that whoever else might catch it would also throw it back?
why would he trust that?
Because he has a limited quantity of fish that he has been allotted, that he
Or-
can fish.
Well, it's a very homogeneous community,
Hmm.
and they all tend to, it's a much smaller community.
True, true. Huh?
Not, it's homogeneous and it's small.
So, but I'm asking is that what is the incentive structure now, right? So, what is the incentive structure in the Indian system in Kerala, for example, and why the person does not throw the small fish back in the water? How does that incentive structure change in ITQ system so that the person would throw the small fish back in the water on their own, not because they feel some obligation to larger community or anything?
Tragedy of commons to now, it was tragedy of the commons to now basically define rights over,
It is, but still I'm not getting
You
the,
get a limited number of fish that you can fish.
you
So
get limited number of
you get a limited number of
quantity, right?
So
So
you want to
500
get
ton
the
of fish that you
maximum
can
out of
catch.
it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you want to get the maximum out of it. You would rather take a bigger fish than a smaller fish.
Right? So you are authorized to collect 500 ton of fish in the example that we use, right? You are free to collect small fish of 500 ton or a big fish of 500 ton. It's up to you. Market price for bigger fish usually is higher than smaller ones, right? And therefore, it is in your self-interest to throw the small fish back in the water and keep only the biggest one, which has the highest market price, right? So that really is the change that you are bringing about under the ITQ system, right? And that's how you are addressing the tragedy of the commons or tragedy of the collective, right? Is by changing the property right structure, which is from the collective ownership to ITQ type of ownership, right? And thereby changing the incentives, and thereby obviously preventing the tragedy of overfishing, right? Which has been the case in the earlier property right structure, right? Okay, so that was about the fishing. Second thing was about the elephant, right? Endangered species in the forest. We talked about Zimbabwe example, right? So I said most of the poachers are usually not people from outside, but people living in and around the forest themselves, right? They become the poachers, right? So once you convert the system to Zimbabwe-style system of community ownership, right? Why wouldn't anybody poach?
That's like stealing from yourself.
What does it mean? Just thinking through what is the incentive structure that you are now changing that will stop the same people who used to poach elephant, right, or kill elephant to be more precise, right, would no longer kill the elephant.
Around has an incentive to stop.
Hmm?
Everybody around who was sharing has an incentive to not police.
That's right, right? Everybody, there are always going to be cheats in any community, right? So there are going to be people who say, okay, I can make a quick buck for myself, by hunting an elephant. And of course, hunting is legal. It is no longer illegal. Selling ivory is also legal within the country because Zimbabwe had refused to sign the CITES Treaty. So you can buy and sell body parts, right? So it's easy temptation to make some money for yourself by poaching an elephant. And you can try, but there'll be other people in the community who are now going to stop you from doing it, right? And even if you succeed in doing it, then they find out, they would excommunicate you. You are no longer part of our community, right? There's always that threat that hangs on your head that if you go too much outside the community recognized behavior, then you could be thrown out of the community. That means you will lose completely your right to some part of the income that community is generating, right? So again, the incentive structure changes. Not that I have somehow listened to C.C. Ravisankar's lecture and have become more conscious about the humanity and the larger natural world, right? It's just the structure within which I'm operating that has changed, and therefore it changes my behavior, right? So I think that's the important sort of part of that discussion that we had about how to deal with the tragedy of the commons or externalities in the case we are discussing. Okay. I'm moving on to next topic, which I think Barun also talked about. I think he was also focusing on politics. So I'm not sure what was his angle on it, but I'm sure you guys would tell me once I. So I have been sort of thinking for last several years that what is going on around the world, right? The deglobalization, right? All of the things, populism on the rise from the left and the right both, right? And much of the explanation that you see, including by very prominent economists, right? Angus Deaton, a Nobel Prize winner, recently published a book saying that what is broken is economics. First, we had done a wrong kind of economics. We've been teaching wrong kind of economics about self-interest and all of that, right? And that is leading to what we are facing now, right? And therefore, there is a lot of discussion about changing economics itself. And there are groups of students in various top universities, including LSE and Stanford and Berkeley, who are working to rethink the foundations of economics, right? So that certainly is one diagnosis of the problem, that what we are facing today is because of bad economics, right? My diagnosis obviously has been the opposite, that reason why we are facing what we are facing is because of bad politics, right? So economics may be somewhat broken, but not really fully broken, doesn't require as much change as we need to think about changing politics itself, right? And so I've been thinking along those lines. So what I'm going to present to you is some of those ideas that I think one can think about fixing politics, right? Now, the moment you talk about politics, the first thing comes up is public choice, right? I'm assuming that you already have discussed this earlier. What is public choice?
Understanding politics through a lens of economics.
Understanding politics through the lens of economics, okay? What else?
I mean, treating everyone, including people in government, bureaucracy, business, etc., as humans and understanding they have their own incentives.
Incentives, yeah. Politicians are self-interested. Yeah. Right. So I think classic story as it goes, Jim Buchanan, one of the founders of public choice discipline, right? As a student was taking classes in economics and political science. So you'll go to economics class, and the whole class is based on the assumption that everybody is self-interested. Consumers are self-interested, the businesses are self-interested, right? The whole economic structure or theory is based on the assumption that everybody who participates in the economic domain is self-interested, right? And he goes to next class, which is political science, and there the basic assumption is that people are public spirited, right? So the king would act for the benefit of the public, the government would act for the benefit of the public, right? So the whole theory is based on how the actors in political science are public spirited. So he asked this question because there are same people at the end of the day who are consumer on one hand and voters or politicians or bureaucrats on the other. How could we have theory which is so diametrically opposite about their own behavior, right? So he said, what would happen if you apply the same logic of self-interested behavior to politics or political actors, right? You could also ask the question about what would happen to economics if you apply the assumption of public spiritedness to economic actors, when nobody has done that so far. That's an open field to research on what would happen in economics if everybody is public spirited. Consumers and businesses are all public spirited, right? What kind of economics would that be? But what we have is public choice, which is about applying economic assumption of self-interest.
Social preferences, so altruism, trust, positive reciprocity.
Yes, yes. Reciprocity and all of that, yeah. But I think it's not like a whole economic system, yeah. True. And so public choice has a very detailed critique of democracy, right? I'm going to just take you through quickly what the critique is so that at least you know. And what I want to offer you is that how do we deal with the critique? So public choice has given a very powerful critique of democracy as normally being practiced around the world, like almost all countries, right? But they have not, in my view, given any solutions to the problem. So they have sort of defined the problem. The democracy as we have it, as we practice it, has these fundamental problems, right? And in my view, they are genuine problems, right? But they have not offered any solutions to those problems. And when you ask for solutions, you don't really get, at least in my view, very good solutions from them, right? So I've been trying to think about how to fix politics. So one way to fix politics is to address the public choice critique of democracy in some form or the other, right? That's the one thing you want to do. And there are, of course, other issues that will come up as we go along. So one way to understand the critique of democracy by public choice is to compare rupee vote versus ballot vote, right? So I vote in the marketplace through my rupees. I buy and sell things, right? I vote in the political space or political market through my ballot vote, right? And so one easy way to understand the critique is compare this. Of course, in the ballot vote, we have one person, one vote, right? While in the rupee vote, one person can have as many votes, as many rupees the person has, right? So there's a complete equality, is complete inequality in that sense, right? The second difference is that in case of rupee vote, I can express intensity of my preference. If I like Apple product a lot more than Samsung, I can put more of my money on Apple product, right? I can show intensity of my preference. In the ballot vote, I only have one vote, right? So even though I like this candidate a lot more than all the others, all that I can do is offer one vote, right? That's all I got, right? I don't have multiple votes to offer, right?
AJCA Gupta, WhatsApp audio.
Can we apply this public choice to corporate finance, like in corporate governance, shareholders voting to choose the board and the board voting on various issues?
And board choosing the CEO and others.
So board is also chosen by shareholders are voting by
Yeah.
So
But I think in the voting case, you have multiple votes, right? It depends on how many shares I own. Suppose I own 1,100,000 shares, I would have 100,000 votes, quote unquote, versus somebody who owns only 100 shares. So it is more like rupee vote as opposed to the ballot vote. Even though it seems like a ballot, but it's more along these lines, right? So in case of ballot vote, no, you may like a candidate's position on one issue, but dislike the position on the other issue, right? So for example, you are in favor of the candidate's position on, say, open border, right? So he's in favor of open borders, which is also you are in favor of, but he is also in favor of minimum wage, right? Which you may be opposed to it. But you don't get to choose half the candidate. You have to choose the full candidate, right? It's a package deal. So you vote for the person, you get both things in one person, right? So in the ballot vote, you don't really have a fine tuning of the choices. You have lump sum choice of the individual running for the office or the political party for whom you are voting, right? Either way. Party also has many positions on different issues, and some you agree with, some you disagree with, but ultimately you have to sort of swallow the bitter pill and vote for one or the other, right? While it's not the case in rupee vote, you can pick and choose. I can buy laptop from Apple and my wristwatch, smartphone or smartwatch from Samsung, right? So I'm pretty free to choose what I want each individual item. So that's a. Now comes the two of the important critique from public choice, right? Which is something I think maybe you have discussed already. Can anybody explain what the argument is?
I mean, for rational ignorant, which is the first one as mentioned.
Hmm.
So the usual understanding is the fact that an average voter will not be able to, for example, if there are 10 parties in a state election, I as a voter will not probably in any sense be able to go through all 10 manifestos and be equally aware about all the policies and whatever each of the representatives are actually stating on different issues. So then why does a person vote when they know that their voting has very little chance to influence an election, right? So that is, I think, what rational ignorance is about.
Ignorance is one that you can cover two things together. There's a rational ignorance and rational absenteeism. So not voting is being absent. So rationally choosing not to vote. And this argument is about rationally choosing not to be informed. Right?
Information acquisition is a cost. So if I want to find out about all the policies, read the entire manifesto.
Yeah. So one way to understand this is last time when you bought your cell phone, ask yourself what you did, right? How much time and effort you spent in deciding which cell phone to buy. And I presume some of you have already voted before. Ask yourself how much time and effort did you spend in deciding which candidate to vote for, right? And usually the answer is very clear in almost all cases, right? That you don't spend as much time thinking about which candidate to vote for as you spend
We
thinking about.
basically vote because that candidate is better than this candidate. So that is why we vote for that candidate. Like
Yeah,
hardly anything.
You can do the same thing in the market. No, you can. Apple is better than Samsung.
No, but without thinking, it's like everyone is doing it.
So if I decide to buy an Apple phone and I spend the money on an Apple phone, I get an Apple phone. But if I decide to vote for a particular party, it's not clear whether they will win because it's not my, my vote has almost statistically no effect on the final outcome. That's why.
And
So-
if they do win, it's unclear if they'll deliver what they promised.
So what
There
I'm
as
getting
well.
out of doing my research on that phone, and I'm getting that immediately in my hand, right, when I buy all the features and everything. On the other hand, when I'm voting for that candidate, they may or may not deliver on the promises. They may not even win, so there are all these uncertainties. So I have less incentive to devote that amount of time to read every single manifesto, then do the analysis, this policy is better, that promise is worse.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's also given to you as a right as free, like you have a legal right to vote.
To vote.
To vote. How much I can maximize my value out of my money, hard-earned money, that's not given to me free. So I think that changes some things.
Also, you can't influence their individual position that way.
Yeah.
So you can make a rough estimate of who you like better, but how even if you deeply look into it.
So one thing is clear that when you invest time and energy deciding which phone to buy, the benefits of that investment goes to you. You get to choose, hopefully get a right phone, right? At a lower price, better technology, whatever benefits that you want to have, right? While if you invest time in deciding who's the right candidate, right, and vote for that candidate, and assume for the sake of argument the candidate does get elected, right? Who is the right candidate for that role, right? The benefits of electing the right candidate goes to who? Everybody, right? He or she would make public policy which applies to everybody living in that jurisdiction, which could be a city or a state or a country, depending on what level of election it was, right? So you did the investment of your time, energy figuring out who the right candidate is among the many on the ballot. Candidate gets elected, if at all. The benefits of that accrues to everyone, including those who didn't even bother to go to vote. Right? So everyone benefits. So the benefits are all diffused. The cost is concentrated on you. Right? You had to do the research and figure out who the right candidate is. Right? And therefore, argument that public choice makes is that informed voting is a public good. And people have tendency to free ride. Right? I don't acquire as much information. Right? So you can push me to go to vote, which is what many countries are trying to do. Right? There's a laws now in many countries. If you don't vote, you get penalized. Sometimes you pay a monetary fine. I think some countries you lose your driving license for a year or so. Right? So we are all forcing voters to go to the polling booth. But that still doesn't solve the problem. Right? The challenge is not just voting. Challenge is informed voting. Right? So I can push you to the ballot booth, but you still can be completely ignorant about the choices you are making. Right? So that's a very important critique of public choice. That in a democracy, the people we fully are dependent on to make the system work are the voters. And voters don't have incentive to cast informed vote. Right? Unlike, say, in a private market, where consumers have all the incentives to make the informed choice, because benefits of the choice accrues to the consumers. Right? And that's really one of the very important critique. Right? And the second one is what is called rational absence. Anyone wants to explain this part of the argument?
The probability of the election being decided by one vote is very.
Yeah, right. Which is 1 over number of voters in the election. So if there are 1 lakh voters, the probability that your vote will decide the final outcome of the election, right, would be 1 over 1 lakh, right? So very low probability that your vote is going to be deciding vote in any election, right? And therefore, one argument is that people choose rationally to be absent, right? And you see that playing out in many countries, right? Which is why we have these laws compelling people to go and vote, right? Because we realize that people are not going to vote on their own, right? And of course, we have to appeal to their civic duty and all of the other things we do every time the election comes around, right? And hopefully enough people go and vote. Pardon?
If every single person thinks like this, oh, my vote is like very everything, and that's like too many people. We don't have, then like, that's just affecting democracy, so to speak. And then we're not, like, we might have complaints with the, current government and whatever, but then we think, oh, what is my vote going to do? And then we don't do it. So then maybe we're becoming a part of the problem. That's
So,
just
so there are other reasons why you may go to vote. So I'm not debating. I'm sure when you think about it, you realize there are reasons why many people do go and vote, right? But voting is on what basis you are making the decision about who to vote for is very different than what is expected by the theory.
I think more and more people will think that lesser and lesser the number of voters are there, probability of one vote changing the election becomes larger and larger.
So I think what public choice is pointing out is that the way democracy is being practiced, and which depends on the voters being the final arbiter of the system, they are not as engaged, right? They are not as informed. They have not as much interest in actually fulfilling their duty, right? And that's what they see as a fundamental problem with any democratic setup, right? And when you ask them now, okay, we understood this problem, what is the solution? So what could be potential solution to the problem of rational absence and rational ignorance?
Minimal government.
Minimum government, right? What else? Yeah.
Charge people money for the right to vote, and more you pay, more you can vote.
Meaning?
The more you pay in taxes, say, the more you can vote.
So why would I bother to vote?
Weighted voting depending on how much you're paying.
Huh?
I'm saying, like, next step would be using social credits.
So I think what John pointed out is really what the answer normally comes up from public choice, right? So focus on the constitution, get your constitution right, right? Which has limited powers given to the government, right? Focus on rule of law working well, and of course focus on separation of powers or functions. So there is no one single entity in the government has full power. This is a checks and balances in the system, right? And those are the ideas which are actually offered as solution to the problem that we discussed earlier. Yeah.
One potential way is to make the vote statistically significant. So instead of choosing an election from an election which is on the scale of India's population, having to make choices which are, say, at the level of this classroom or the level of the next few neighborhood blocks, and so on and so forth. So a ward would be still a statistically significant place to vote, and to make that feasible in solving things.
Yeah.
Adding to that point, in India, the problem is that we don't have much local government versus a state, a central government making our decisions for the local people. We don't have local government isn't as effective as in terms of policy as central.
Or the powers are very few in the local government's hand.
In terms of representation, also there is more central government rather than local government.
Is it representation? What do you mean?
Representation meaning the amount of people we have in local governments versus the amount of people we have in central government is
No.
the
We
disparity
have
is huge.
so MCD has many more councillors, right? Obviously, this is how, because the constituencies are smaller, you get many more people for Delhi city government than you will get for Delhi parliament. There are only 7 seats for the whole of Delhi for the MPs. There are only 7 MPs, but there are 149 councillors. Right? So local government has many more people in the governance structure elected to govern. Whether they govern well or not, that's a different story. But number of people are many more at the local level than at the central level.
I'm talking about and even about let's say the amount of government employees in the local.
Even that will be higher at the local level.
It's high. The stat
Yeah.
that I read said that it's higher.
No. State and local will be higher than center. I mean, you can just imagine how many departments every state government has, how many departments are there in every city government, right? So just multiply those numbers. Okay, so this is a common sort of counter argument that, you just limit the role of the government. Now the question becomes who does all this work? Now how does it get done, right? So unless you are sort of American founding fathers drafting constitution for you, right? How do you get the right constitution in place? How do you get the rule of law working, right? How do you get checks and balances working? Actually, you can see what's going on in our own country in terms of checks and balances of power, right? So all of those are dependent on something else, which is the nuts and bolts of day-to-day politics, right? Who gets elected, how they get elected, right? All of those things equally are important as these are important, right? And so my focus has been that, okay, even if you get this right, you still have to do a bit of more work, right? If that was the case, the US would have remained what it was 250 years ago, right? They got the constitution right, they got the rule of law right, they got separation powers right. Then how has the government grown from 2% of GDP to 40% of GDP, right? So US government did grow despite all of this being right, quote unquote, right? So then what is it that's did not work, right? And that's where I think I'm focusing on about nuts and bolts of day-to-day politics and see how you think through those, how do you make them work better in order for these things to have more longevity or more sustainability in terms of what you may have done in the first draft of the Constitution, right? So what I'm focusing on is electoral systems. I'll talk about briefly. We have multiple kinds of electoral systems. First past the post that we practice in India. There are different ones. Currently, the two that I talked about a lot are ranked choice voting and quadratic system, right? Direct democracy, something that you referred to earlier at the local level, small groups of communities voting and deciding for themselves. There are many experiments of those kinds being done, right? Interesting idea I found in the Gandhian constitution. There was a constitution being offered in 1940s by the followers of Gandhi. And they had a very interesting idea in terms of how to govern independent India, right? Then there's an idea of random selection. We'll talk about that briefly. The citizen assembly. And the last one, which I think is probably more important for in the Indian context, is a political party law. The argument here has been the political parties have hardly any restrictions, hardly any requirements of transparency and disclosure. So in theory, yes, they have to disclose their audited accounts. Many of them don't. Some of them disclose only after a few years, right? Nothing really happens to them, right? If you look at, on the other hand, right? And my argument here is that we need to figure out how to make political parties more transparent, more accountable, more democratic. So unless they are democratic themselves, it's difficult for them to sustain democracy outside, right? And so just thinking through about political party law, very similar to what we have like a companies law. Like we regulate companies in the economic sphere. So my argument is that we would have to regulate also political parties in the political sphere in the similar way, right? So I'm going to take you through some of these arguments. You can see they don't really answer fully the critique of public choice of democracy, right? So that still remains to be addressed. And I think that's something I want to sort of explore with you. How do we apply some of these ideas together to address that critique? Good.
That like with the advent of smartphones and digital technology, why can't we have like online or digital
Digital?
online voting or through mobile phones?
Yeah. But does it solve the problem?
We have cybersecurity.
True, true. But does it solve the problem? Suppose we had everybody on the mobile phone. Suppose we figure out how to do it. If all of us can vote on every issue in the parliament or in the city government, would that solve the problem?
Absolutism might be solved.
No, no, no. Would that solve the problem of informed voting? See, problem is informed voting. Just because I have power to vote on every issue in the parliament, would that make me informed? No.
Assuming that we solve the practical cybersecurity issues.
No, we are assuming all of that.
Yeah, I think it can, because if let us say we are voting on a specific issue, I mean the app can be designed in a way that it will show the sort of a summary of the bill.
Sure.
And stuff. So there's more chance that I'm going to read it.
Now imagine how many issues are debated in every year in parliament.
I mean, it will still be better than what we have today, because I will still at least be able to go through the issue and vote for it.
It will be much worse.
So then only the informed
Just,
voter-
we are currently we are voting for one candidate or one party every 4 or 5 years. Even that is not allowing us to get informed about who to vote for. You are saying I have to vote for every day for 5 issues, the local level, state level, and national level, for example, right? Somehow I would find time to read about all 5 issues and then cast an informed vote.
Include the fact that there are concentrated costs and dispersed benefits, right? So let's say that something that comes in, it's going to benefit most people, but it's going to only hurt some people, but hurt them really, really bad. They would do the informed, not just informed voting, but informed propaganda to make everybody else also vote as per what they want. So it's actually like it's not really
but then the discussion will go on the specific policy instead of a specific candidate or specific party. Which
True. That part we all agree on. But who has time to do discussions of those kind, right? So question that we are asking is that even if you have to vote once in 4 years, even in that case, you are not being more informed, right? How would you become informed on 100 of issues every day?
I would say that one thing is that a lot of people, like if you go in metros and everywhere, people do listen to, of course, that content is hardly informative, but people do listen to political content a lot, which discusses about specific candidates, right? That is under discussion. But if we are voting for specific policies instead of that particular candidate, I mean, maybe the people who are making content, they will make content about that policy. So at least that will be.
Maybe it's a good thing to try out. Maybe we can list issues being voted upon in the, say, current session of the parliament, right? Issues being voted upon in the current session of Delhi Assembly, or pick any other state that you are interested in, right? So what are the bills pending? Just bills pending, right? Which is what they are going to be voting on. And the bills pending at this city level, whichever city you are interested in. Just put them together and see how many of you would go through all of those bills and take an informed choice about which way to vote, for or against. Let's assume the only option is either for or against. There's no in between, which could also be true, right? You don't have to vote for and against. You can have some amendment and then vote for the amended bill. We are out removing that from the possibility just to make it simple, and list those out and ask yourself how many of your friends and family members would actually take the time to read through those issues and cast an informed vote.
They might not read the entire document. Yeah, that's for sure. But I mean, you have Chat GPT. You can summarize it. You can have summaries, pros and cons, everything. So people can. I don't know.
No, that the political parties would give you summaries. No. So if I am Congress, I'm going to give you summary of the bill myself. So you see the bill in my light. The BJP is going to give you summary of the bills from their point of view. So you see the bill in their light, and you can read all of them.
Isn't it better than talking about Narendra Modi versus Rahul Gandhi? That okay, at least getting the bias summary of the bill.
I don't know. That's the question.
Yeah.
So it's a good debate, right? Which is why we are debating it. That would be better just, and we have countries which do have such a voting system. Estonia, obviously, is one of the first countries which has everybody being able to vote through the mobile phone, right? So they figured out how to make that system work. But they have not gotten to voting on every issue in the legislature, right? So yes, it's possible to do the technologically, but does it really solve the problem that public choice highlights about informed voting, right? In my sense is it doesn't really, it just even compounds the problem. There are so many issues of so many different kinds that I'm asked to vote for which I would have hardly any knowledge. Which is why the whole idea of representative democracy, right? We went from direct democracy to the idea of representative democracy was precisely that we don't have time or information to cast informed votes on every issue that has to be dealt with. Therefore, we elect one person or one party and say, you will decide on our behalf for the next 4 years, right? And we would have to trust your judgment for those 4 years. Yeah.
Some barrier like educational qualification restrictions for standing in and having representative democracy and then having
Yeah, but people don't accept that, no, unfortunately. Right? If you say education qualification, either you get people cheating on it, right? And or or people would say, why isn't the uneducated person allowed to stand for the office, right?
I mean, you wouldn't allow someone like Ritesh Agarwal to vote in that way. Who's the founder of Koyo? He dropped out of college, so education qualification is not a good idea.
some experience in the
You wouldn't allow him to stand for
some
elections.
criteria to be able to stand in election.
Yeah, I think many people have tried. In the old days, there were criteria. So I'll talk about one system we had in India during the Chola Empire, where you have to own a house to be able to run for the office, right? So the criteria of property, which was, I think, true also in the US, you have to own a property of some kind to be able to become a voter, right? So, but obviously people thought it was very anti-democratic, right? And therefore, what we now have across the world is universal franchise. Everyone can vote, everyone can run for the office, with only requirement being age, 35 years or older, right? That's the only requirement we have, right? Would that be better system to have some qualifications? Okay. So why the electoral system matters, right? The way we elect. So what an electoral system is supposed to do is to aggregate individual preferences of the voters and create something cohesive outcome at the end, right? So summarize those preferences in a way so that there is one person being chosen as a representative of those preferences. So you want an electoral system to work in a way so that there is a ample representation of the people and their preferences are accounted for in the final outcome that election throws up, person who gets elected, right? So that's ideally what you want electoral system to do, right? And what I'm trying to show you is that the final outcome of an election depends much more on the electoral system we use than even the voters and the candidates, right? So what I'm going to show you basically is that with the same candidates and the same group of voters, depending on which electoral system I use, I'll get a different outcome, right? So the outcome of an election is not representative of the preferences of the voters as much as we like, right? It depends a lot more on the system that aggregates those preferences into an outcome, right? And that aggregation process itself creates its own problems, right? Okay, so we have 25 voters and 5 candidates. So 1 to 25 are the voters and 5 candidates, which is V, W, X, Y, and Z, right? So we now ask each candidate or each voter to tell us about their preference, right? The order in which they prefer these 5 candidates, right? So basically we are say plugging into their brain and finding out what the preferences are. And I'm listing those preferences here. So voter number 1 has this set of preferences, right, among the 5 candidates. So voter number 1 prefers V the most and Z the least, and the rest of them are in between, right? Voter number 2 has slightly different preferences. The 3 has different preferences, right? And so on and so forth. I can have all 25 of them listed the same way, right? Now, some of them would have the same preference. So now those who have same preference, I'm grouping them together in one single group. So group 1 would have people with the same preferences. Group B would have a separate list of people who are with the same preferences, right? So I'm dividing 25 voters into different groups depending on the similarity of the preference, right? So 25 voters, we listed all the preferences, divided into them into groups. This is how it looks like, right? So group A has 8 voters with this particular preference that you saw for voter number 1, right? There are 8 voters with the same, exact same preference out of 25, right? There are 7 voters group B who have that preference out of 25. And of course, group C, group D, and group E. Right? Group E has 2 voters, D has 3, C has 5, the total 25 voters, right? So we divided 25 voters in terms of their preferences among 5 candidates. Any questions so far? Clear? How we got to this point, right? Okay, so now we run the election, right? So this is first past the post system, right, which is what we use in India, and many other countries also use the system, right? What the system says that you need to have 1 more vote than the next person, next candidate, to win the election. You don't need a majority of vote, right? You need plurality of vote, meaning 1 more vote than the next person, and you would win the election, right? So whoever gets the highest number of votes in the election wins it, right? This is how the first past the post system works. So who would win this election? Why? Right? So there are 8 voters who prefer V as a first choice compared to everybody else, right? So the group A would vote for V, group B would vote for Z, group C would vote for W, group D, 3 voters would vote for Y, and of course 2 voters would vote for X, right? So count those votes. 8 is higher than everybody else. The person with the 8 votes is going to win, right? So in the first past the post system, the winner is V. Is that clear? Now look at the ranking of preferences and see something odd about it.
V is preferred by 15 voters.
Okay. V is least preferred by
3/5 of the voters.
15 voters. So the majority of voters out of 25 think V is the worst candidate. But V actually wins. Right?
I guess Y is the most popular candidate overall, if you see.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you see the second one.
Now, what are the implications of this? So if you think about what does it mean in the real life, right? So think of a political parties, candidates, right? You know this is a system that you are competing within, right? First past the post system. That tells you that I need to have one more vote than the next guy to win the election. So what is my strategy to win the election? Polarization, right? So can I create a group of 8 voters who are going to be solidly behind me, no matter what, right? So it could be caste, could be religion, right? Could be anything else for that matter, right? What we could refer to as vote bank politics, right? So vote bank politics is not somehow a flaw of the system, it's the feature of the system, right? So once we have this system of first past the post, right, automatically means that the people are going to target narrow groups of voters, right, just big enough to get one more vote than the next guy, right? And so I don't have to appeal to majority of voters in the population, right? Even though 15 out of 25 are opposed to me, I can still win the election, right? And therefore you create a system where there is a much more diverse division and polarity than
multi-party system,
Huh.
if when there are 5 people, how
Hmm.
would that play out? Like how
Exactly like this. There are 5 candidates. So you have 5 parties or 5 candidates. No? Hmm. So you begin to see the challenges with the first past the post system, right? Okay. So we run an election through a different system. This is the primary system which is used in the US, right, for the presidential election. So there is one round of election where Democrats among themselves and Republicans among themselves compete. There's one guy gets elected from the Democratic side, other guy gets elected from the Republican side, and those 2 guys then finally run for the final round, right? So there are 2 rounds of elections in a way. So it's called a primary system. So if you run the primary system here with the same 25 voters, same 5 candidates, who are the 2 candidates that would win the first round? V and Can you explain why? So everybody is aligned.
V has the highest and Z has the second highest number of votes.
Right? So V is going to get 8 votes and Z is going to get 7 votes, right, out of 25. So those 2 are going to be the winners in the first round, right? Now you run the second round in which you only have now 2 candidates, V and Z or Z, right? Other 3 are now off the ballot.
this is like more like a runoff, right, than a primary.
Yeah,
This is more like a runoff system than a primary.
same.
The primary there will be different rounds.
But you got the first round, no?
So
5 candidates.
it's assuming that V is in one party.
You can, or either way. Okay, so V and Z win the first round. Who wins the second round? You see why?
Yeah, the preferences are the least.
Yeah. So who is going to vote for V? Of course, 8 voters would vote for V, the first preferred choice.
And Group B.
The
Group B would also vote for V.
No, Group B would vote for who? E. Okay. So Group A and E is going to vote for V, right? Do you see why? Because V is above Z, right, in the preference list here for group. In everywhere else, of course, V is at the bottom, as you saw, right? So for all these 3 groups, Z obviously is more preferred than V. V is the bottom of the preference, right? So all these 15 voters would vote for Z, and group A, 8 plus 2, 10 would vote for V, right? So in this primary system, Z would win the election, right? So you begin to see the beauty or power of the system, right? With the same 5 candidates, same 25 voters, you get a very different outcome depending on what system you use, right? There are many more systems, yeah.
But this assumes that that voters don't vote strategically based on the system?
So I'm making a simplest possible case, right? You can make it more complicated by assuming many other things, right? And get it even more complicated results. But even assuming that everybody remains stable vote, all of that, even then you get different outcome. Right? So I'm not going to go through all the systems. There are many systems which have been tried. Of course, it turns out this is a ranked choice. This is some data on the Indian elections. I think highest vote the political party got was 48% in '84, right? The lowest has been 26.5% and still be able to form the government, right? And you can see how this plays out. If you have 100 people of the voting age, only 75 are registered to vote. Among 75, only some of them actually go to vote, right? So all of that calculation that you do, you begin to realize that democracy, even though it's supposed to be by the people, is really not really by the people as much as we like it to be, right? So two things, right? One, the most people are not voting or participating. Even if they are voting, they are not casting informed vote, right? And second, many of them are absent, the rational absence argument, right? And the third, obviously, that depending on the system, you get different outcomes. So even though I'm casting informed vote, the result depends as much on the electoral system as my informed vote that I'm casting, right? So system becomes a third variable in the analysis, which also has its own impact on the final outcome. Now, of course, you can ask, isn't there an ideal voting system, right? And turns out that there is none. So, of course, many people have tried to figure this out, but there is no one single ideal voting system that addresses all possible challenges, right? And therefore, you are making a choice among the second best, right? But within second best, there are obviously better choices, right? First past the post is probably the worst possible system when you begin to think about it, right? Of course, it has advantages, which is why it was adopted, and many countries did adopt it earlier. But many countries are now moving away from that system, right? So there are many ideas around what kind of system we should have. Ranked choice voting is one. How much time do we have?
About 35 minutes.
35 minutes. So I have a few videos. I don't know if I have time to show the video. So ranked choice voting, quadratic voting, another new idea which has been sort of discussed and debated. So there are quite a few ideas now on the table in terms of what kind of electoral system we should have, right? As I said, there is no one single best system. So you would have to make choices depending on the context, depending on what you think system can handle, capacity of the government to run the election, right? All of those factors, and of course, ultimately voters who can understand the system and vote accordingly. So you would figure out which one makes more sense in a given country. This is an idea which comes out from the Gandhian constitution. So in the 1940s, when we were debating our own constitution to the Constituent Assembly, there are many groups of people in the country who had their own ideas of what should free India look like, right? And they were working on it for many, many years, right? So there's a constitution being offered by the CPM, the Communist Party of India. They had also offered their vision of what free India should look like. The constitution offered by the followers of Ram Manohar Lohia. They had slightly different vision of what free India should look like. And there was one offered by the followers of Gandhi, right? And of course, each one is very different, as you can imagine, in terms of their focus and emphasis, right? One thing that I found very interesting about the Gandhian constitution, and of course, I'm calling it Gandhian, but it's not really written by Gandhi. It was written by other people. Gandhi has a preface to it saying that some of these ideas have been discussed with me. I generally am in agreement with the approach taken by this group, and therefore I'm endorsing the broad idea of this constitution, even though, of course, not each item in the constitution is endorsed by him, right? Oh, you can play.
Onslaught of negative political ads that air on your TV every election season? Fear mongering. The half truths. Believe it or not, there's a simple reform we can enact to make elections more bearable for voters. It's called ranked choice voting, or RCV, and it could change our politics.
Can you hear it?
Here's a quick refresher on how it works. Some pets. Owned by my colleagues here at Inequality Media. When you head to the ballot box under ranked choice voting,
Thank you.
instead of voting for just one candidate, you have the option to rank candidates in order of preference. First, second, third, and so on. So if you're stuck between two preferred candidates for a position, you can spread your preferences out in hopes that one of them wins. I really like Daisy, but I think Beatrix might be a better choice. So I'll rank Beatrix first and Daisy second. When ballots are counted, if none of the candidates gets an outright majority, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and their votes are redistributed to their supporters' second choice candidate. This process continues until a candidate receives over 50% of the vote and is declared the winner. Congratulations, Beatrix. Pretty cool, huh? It's also good for a whole host of other reasons. Implementing RCV could have the added benefit of making our elections, well, nicer. Take the recent election in Alaska, for example.
It's so funny that even in this race, people actually hold our friendship against us.
Compare that to what we see in places without RCV.
Far left John Fetterman is too far left. He's dangerously liberal on crime.
In a ranked choice voting system, candidates are less likely to engage in this kind of mudslinging because they're not just trying to be a voter's first choice, they also want to be the second choice of voters or backing their opponents. This can motivate anyone running for office to be more inclusive and appeal to a broader range of voters, helping to connect people who don't always agree on every issue. RCV also allows us to exercise our right to vote without feeling like we're compromising our beliefs or simply voting for the, quote, lesser of two evils. We could vote for the candidates we like most rather than voting against the candidates we like least. RCV could also open the door to voters casting their ballots for more third-party candidates. Even if your favorite candidate from your preferred party is not favored to win, that person could still be your first choice without you feeling like you're giving up your vote entirely. If your candidate doesn't make it to the final round, your second or third choice could still end up winning in the final tally. Ranked choice voting can even change the kinds of people who run for office for the better. Potential candidates wouldn't have to avoid running for fear of splitting the vote or spoiling a close election, allowing for a potentially more diverse pool of candidates to run. Again, look at Alaska, where voters used RCV to elect Mary Peltola to Congress, making her the first Alaskan native and first woman to represent the state in the U.S. House. Lastly, ranked choice voting saves everyone, you, me, elections officials, time and money. There would no longer be runoffs, which can be costly and often have lower turnout, which means election results that are less likely to reflect the will of the public. There's a reason why RCV is starting to sweep the nation. It's currently being used by 13 million voters across the country. Ranked choice voting makes elections less painful, less expensive, and can help make our government more inclusive and responsive to what people actually want. Maybe you can organize to make ranked choice voting a reality where you live.
Since you are playing it, you can go to the next.
You can still use it later.
Yeah. No, I want to play one more. Quadratic, I'm not playing quadratic because it's a similar idea. So go to something different. So let me finish this about the. So what the Gandhian constitution says is that you have election only at the local level. Right? Gandhi was very much in favor of Gram Swaraj and making sure that the lowest level of governance or unit has the most power. Right? So one way they were trying to capture that in the system was saying that you have election only at the local level. From those who got elected at the local level, some of whom are elected among themselves to go to the state assembly. Those who get elected at the state level, some of whom elect among themselves to go to the parliament, right? So, but every person from the MP in the parliament to a legislature in the state assembly to a corporator or Gram Panchayat member they're all getting elected only once from the public, right? Rest are, of course, in the sequential election among them, those who got elected by the public, right? And this is how they thought they would have more control over all representatives across the board, irrespective of which level of government they are representing, right? Because they're all tied to one single locality, right? You're living in the same area, whether you are MP, MLA, or a corporator, right? So there's a lot more intimacy with the public. Public knows you. Hopefully that gives you a little more pressure, social pressure on you, more accountability, right? So Gandhian idea was that this is how we can give a lot more power to the local government. Since everybody has come from the local government, the assumption was that the power would remain with the local government, right? Because that's where the direct elections are taking place, right? And this was a very interesting idea if you think about it. It does many things, right? Just to highlight a couple of them. One, that I no longer have to serve the constituency of lakhs of people. Today, an MP constituency is about more than 10 lakhs, right? I need that much money even to reach out to 10 lakh voters and tell them why they should vote for me, right? So a lot more money is required, a lot more resources are required to be able to campaign in such a large constituency. Local election becomes far smaller, right? You don't need as much money to run for the office. And therefore, as he was pointing out, you get very different kinds of people running for the office, right? If you need a lot of money and muscle power to run for the office, only a certain kind of people would run for the office, right? You and I most likely would not run for the office. But if it can be done, that I build my reputation in the locality by doing work for the last 10 years, and I don't need as much money to run for the office, I'm more likely to run for the office, right? So it just increases the pool of people who can run for the office. Secondly, I think that's very interestingly is that in the today's large-scale elections, particularly elections of president directly being done in the case of US, the qualities required to be a successful campaigner in the election campaign and the qualities required to be a successful administrator begin to diverge more and more, right? So just think about that. The Trump can compete in the election campaign. He has the qualities to compete, right? Has very little qualifications to be able to run the government and very little interest even in running the government, right? And so what you see is that as the constituency become bigger and bigger, the different qualities are required to be a successful campaigner than what is required to be administrator. And you see the divergence happening, which is you see in many, many countries now, right? And therefore, the local election is one way to reduce that kind of pressure on having the charisma and all of those things that you need to be able to appeal to large number of voters in one go, right? So that's the other benefit of the Gandhian idea of local election, right? So that's the other item I'm putting on the agenda. Then play this video.
Parth, is this system used in any countries today?
No. Even I did not know it was being proposed. Nobody has ever talked about this idea. But it is an interesting possibility to explore, yeah.
I want to talk about one of the big questions, perhaps the biggest question. How
do you solve the incentive problem? I have no incentive to do good because I'm not going to be re-elected. I'll just laze around.
So I don't understand one part. So they were showing examples of different countries. No, the speaker was showing examples of various countries in different places. So I mean, how has this been implemented? I've heard about it for the first time. So yeah, like what was that map about? Like was it about the movements that are promoting it?
Yes, yes. So movements and of course local level trials which are running.
No, so
right?
I mean, you mentioned like few issues there. It was written. I read that same-sex marriage and abortion. So what does that have to do with?
So I'll come to that. I think he was combining two things. Second thing.
Also, is there any data on? I mean, one way they kind of do this is jury systems versus like
randomly selected jurors. Yeah.
Do juries make better to have
There's a lot of research on that, as you can expect. Yeah, comparing jury system versus. I don't know the full answer to that, but I assume there is a lot of research. Yeah.
Who will do the sorting and how will you ensure that?
Pardon?
Who will do the sorting and how will you ensure that it is a random sorting?
Oh, I mean, that too, I think there are 1,000 different ways of making it random. No? I mean, I'm sure we have been doing it on our laptop, randomly generated. Yeah. Yeah. So I think one variation of this is that you don't select any random voter, right? You can select those who raise their hands. So one way to address the issue of incentive is that only those people who raise their hands, among them you then randomly select. And it turns out that this is not really that novel an idea. We had the very similar system in the Chola Empire in Tamil Nadu. There are inscriptions which I'm showing you here of the system on various temples in this particular town. I don't know, some of you who are there, you may know the town. Right? And as you see that the way is to work is there is some qualification for you run for the office. Age, as I mentioned, that you need to own a house, right? But once you meet those criteria, you can raise your hand or put your name in the matka, right, for various offices. So there is a Pradhan, village Pradhan office, you put your name in there, and then somebody will draw cheat out of it, and then that person will become the Pradhan, right? Similarly, somebody else in charge of water supply, which is how the 4 or 5 positions for which election used to happen at the time, right? So there is some basic requirement to qualify to run for the office, and then of course, secondly, you have to put your name, right, in the matka to be able to get selected. And this is how pretty large chunk of India in the South India was governed, at least as far as we can tell, right? What it turns out interestingly is that at the time of the origin of democracy or idea of democracy, there are many, many experiments that happened. The Athens he talked about the machine they had through which you throw your name in the coin, and then coin would go up and down, and the coin that comes out at the bottom is selected, coin that comes out at the top is not selected, or other way around, depending on how you, right? So there's a lot of ways of randomization that you see, the techniques that people had come up with, how to randomize these names. And so now I think we have somehow gotten very fixated on a particular kind of system, right? And then any change in the system becomes more and more difficult even to imagine, let alone to put into practice, right? And I think my one submission is that we need to rethink this political system itself, right? And unless we begin to rethink about that, we are not going to be able to fix the politics compared to how it works today. What he was showing is this, right? So for example, it's a similar idea of citizen assembly. So what many countries have been doing, and this is what he was showing there, like same-sex marriage, or for example, abortion decision in Ireland, right, is a Catholic country. No political party would even dare touch the issue, right? They would never be either for or against, because that's the kiss of death for any political party, right? So people realize that no political party is going to address this issue, but at some point they have to address it, one way or the other, right? And the way they address this was to create a citizen assembly, which is randomly selected citizens, voters, right? About 200 of them are selected. They're given some months' time. They're given resources. They can ask for any expert to come and advise them or answer their questions. They have right to assemble other people, consult them, right? So all of those resources are given to them. At the end of the period, they decide what the legal status would be of abortion in the country, and then Parliament simply votes that decision into law, right? So things that Parliament would not address are now getting decided through citizen assembly. There's one use, which is what he was pointing out, randomly selected people in the assembly who make the decision, right? Similarly, for example, in Netherlands, the discussion we are having here about the first past the post system versus ranked choice system, right? They also had the similar discussion in the country. They realized that what they have is not so good, but they also realize that no political party is going to change it, because they all have benefit in the current system. They are structured that way. They are designed to function within the system, right? Who is going to change the system? And therefore, they created citizen assembly again randomly selected 150 people, and say, you guys do the research, thinking, debating, and figure out which system is good for the country, right? And then they instituted the system that the assembly chose, right? So many of the important decisions are now being taken by these randomly selected citizens, right? And that's in a sense what is getting practiced, and we have to see how well that works. Okay, last one before we take questions. Economic democracy, political democracy, right? In the economic democracy, we have companies or firms as a main unit. In political democracy, we have the political parties as main unit, right? They're very similar to firms in the economy. And this is what we have to govern the companies, right? There are requirements of transparency, disclosure, right? Audited accounts to be submitted. Even if you're a public limited corporation, you have to have voting annual general meeting where the shareholders would have right to vote, right? All of those things are being prescribed and have to be followed, right? What do we have for political parties? Hardly anything, right? Even those things are listed here are not really fulfilled, right? There is no power in the Election Commission's hand to penalize any political party for not following even the 2-3 basic things are required, right? So I think one question to ask is that, is it time to regulate political parties? Right? And it turns out that when you ask that question, there are quite a few countries, not that many, but few countries who have done this for a long time. The two, interestingly, are Germany and Italy. So in both of those countries, there is a political party law that describes in as much detail as we have for the Companies Act, right, how parties should function, including, for example, that members should be publicly listed, who are the members of political parties, right? And new elections have to happen, right? The secret ballot in the election must be used, right? So there's norms of those kinds which require political parties to be more democratic and more transparent in their own operation, right? And thereby, obviously, hopefully, they do a better job. And it turns out, if you look at the history, the reason why Germany and Italy did it from the very beginning is because of the experience they had with Hitler and Mussolini, right? So they realized that just by having democracy, elections, doesn't really guarantee you the right kind of people are going to be elected, right? You need to have one more step in the process to regulate who is able to run for those elections and how they get to that position of running for the office, right? And therefore, both of those countries design very detailed political party law, right? And it's interesting for us to also think about how do we make sure the political parties, which are the very foundational unit of democracy, they themselves are democratic in their approach, in their working, and accountable as we expect government to be accountable. Right? Okay, so those are some of the broad ideas. And now, I have one more question. I forgot. So in economics, we have invisible hand, right? What does it mean? I'm sure by now you guys are expert at this. What's the idea of invisible hand in economics? Huh?
Unintended beneficial consequences or beneficial unintended consequences.
But how? Huh?
Spontaneous order blocks easier.
Oh, wow. For spontaneous order, what?
That the market's got these invisible forces. It doesn't need any external force to sort of regulate it, and everything's gonna fall into place by itself. Just trust the market. Yeah.
And again, when you say market,
Just the price levels.
and so there are two things required for the market to work. And three we talked about earlier. At least Smith talked about two of those very clearly in The Wealth of Nations, right? So it's not in his invisible hands, it's not some miracle that happens randomly, right? It requires certain system in place, right? Which is what the whole analysis Smith was trying to do in Wealth of Nations. What is the system required to be able to create that invisible hand, right? What it means is that the self-interests of the players is aligned with the larger public interest, right? So my self-interest as a consumer is to get the cheapest bargain, right? Item with the lowest cost, best quality, which is what I'm trying to look for in the marketplace, which is my self-interest, right? So I'm looking for a company or a product that gives me lower price, better quality, right? The self-interest of the business is to maximize their profit. I'm looking for a customer who will pay me the highest price for the good that I'm selling, right? So each one of them is trying to fulfill that self-interest in the marketplace, right? In the process, what we create is the market system, right? Which enhances quality of products, has innovation built into it, technological advancement, right? Competition drives both consumers and the producers to do better than what they did before, right? And that's really the idea of invisible hand, that I'm creating a system which aligns self-interest of the players, consumers and businesses in this case, with the larger public interest of getting better product, cheaper products, higher standard of living, right? Which is what the public interest is, right? And the Smith's argument is that if you have a system of property rights, right, and competition, then that system would create this invisible hand, meaning it will align the self-interest of the players in the marketplace with the larger public interest, right? And that's really is the key idea behind the invisible hand. So invisible hand actually is those institutions of private property and competition that you maintain. If you maintain those institutions, you get the alignment of self-interest with the public interest, right? And that's really the biggest learning of economics, is this idea of how to align these two interests, right? Okay. And that's the question we have for politics, right? So broadly, if you think about it, what we have to answer for, right, is to how do we align the self-interest of the players in politics, which is the politicians, bureaucrats, and voters, with a larger public interest, right? So what kind of institutional architecture will bring about that alignment? And if you have an answer to that question, like we found in economics, right, you will be able to then get a better political system, right, where the functional system is aligned with the larger public interest, along with the self-interest of the players in the system, right? And that's why I have a question mark here. We need the Adam Smith of politics, right? Which we haven't yet had. And so that's really where all of you come in. So see whether you can fulfill that box. Okay, so, and well on time?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect.